live on YouTube as well. The program is being recorded. And I thank the audience that is coming in, and we will be getting started very shortly. Someone is having trouble registering. Let's see. Okay. Well, folks, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Welcome to this program, The Blockade of Artsakh and Global Indifference. My name is Marc Mamigonian. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs for the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. We have a lot to do today, so let me be brief. First, and most of all, we want to express our solidarity with the Armenians of Artsakh who have been held hostage since December 12th, when the lifeline to Armenia, the Latchian corridor, was blocked by Azerbaijani, finger quotes, environmental activists, with the Russian, finger quotes, peacekeepers who are supposed to be in charge of the corridor doing little or nothing about it. Second, I must thank the co-sponsors of this program, the Mashtots Chair in Armenian Studies at Harvard University and the Society for Armenian Studies. And also I wish to thank the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation for their continuing support of NAASR's Contemporary Armenian Issues lecture series. I'm very grateful to our distinguished panelists for their willingness to collaborate and participate on extremely short notice. I will introduce them momentarily, but I now want to ask my co-moderator, Professor Christina Maranci, who coincidentally happens to be both the Mashtots Chair and the President of the Society for Armenian Studies, to say a few words as well. Christina.
Thanks, Marc. I want to echo Marc's words of welcome and also thank him and NAASR for all the work they've done to draw awareness to the crisis in Artsakh from the very first days of the war to the present crisis. And I want to say I'm also grateful for events like this one, in which we can put our heads together, not only to address issues and solve problems, but to get some sense of fellowship. This is particularly true for today's event in that it addresses one of the many surreal aspects of the crisis in Artsakh, the resounding silence from Western news media outlets. If you were like me, you spend time each day scrolling the pages of your favorite news websites and leaf through newspapers that come to your door looking for one thing, some coverage of the tragedy that faces Armenians right now in Artsakh. And with some exceptions, the outcome is silence. And in those exceptions is the familiar both sidism and the dissembling and bigoted language, which is ever more disturbing in the face of what is now a humanitarian crisis, disturbing not only for itself, but also in contrast to the coverage of other areas and other peoples, perhaps sometimes even on the facing page of a newspaper that's written in a language of sympathy and solidarity. So I'm really excited today to hear from our learned panelists who have an extraordinary array of experience in a range of spheres. And that's all from me. So I think we should open the panel.
Thank you, Christina. As I mentioned before, the panelists today have made time in their busy schedules to be with us. They have each and all impressive bios and bibliographies of their publications and work, which due to time, of course, I'm not going to detail. But in alphabetical order, they are Dr. Bedross Matossian, Associate Professor of Modern Middle East History, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, who recently co-edited with Sosi Kasparian an important roundtable in the International Journal of Middle East Studies titled Fault Lines and Fractures in the 2020 Artsakh Nagorno-Karabakh War, Silence, Absence, and Erasure in Middle East Studies. This was published last year and in many ways provided us with a framework for thinking about this event today. David L. Phillips, Director of the Program on Peace Building and Rights at the Columbia University Institute for the Study of Human Rights, which counts among its many important initiatives the Artsakh Atrocities Documentation Project. And of course, David has been among the most vocal and outspoken voices on this subject for some time now. Lara Setrakian, journalist and president of the Applied Policy Research Institute based in Yerevan, Armenia, where she's coming to us from today, whose most recent piece, at least the most recent that I've seen, discussed the blockade crisis and appeared on CNN.com just within the past couple of weeks. This is the first time we've had Lara with us on a NAASR program since she was a Harvard undergraduate, and we are very happy to have her back today. And Dr. Henry Theriault, who is the most recent past president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars and Associate Vice President of Academic Affairs at Worcester State University in Massachusetts. Now, I'm going to invite each of the speakers in the order I just introduced them to speak for several minutes, following which we will have a period of discussion, and then we will have open audience Q&A, for which you will need to submit questions using the Zoom Q&A function. This topic is a large one, even within the fairly narrow remit we have set out for ourselves today, and it intersects with even larger ones. But please keep your questions to the fairly narrow focus of the panel, as those are the questions that will be chosen. So I will now ask Bedross Matossian, Bedross, to unmute himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc, Christina, NAASR, the Society for Armenian Studies, and Mashtots Chair for organizing this very timely panel discussing an urgent humanitarian crisis. As a scholar historian, I'm interested more in the ambivalence of the academic world towards the blockade. It's been around 30 days, more than 30 days, that Artsakh is under blockade by the so-called eco-activists acting under the orders of the authoritarian regime of Aliyev. This theatrical presentation by the so-called civil society totally contradicts the fact that civil society does not exist in Azerbaijan. Today, hundreds of political prisoners serve in the prisons of Azerbaijan. According to the Working Group on a Unified List of Political Prisoners in Azerbaijan, there are hundreds of prisoners serving time in the Azerbaijani prisoners. These include journalists, bloggers, human rights defenders, political and social activists, lifetime prisoners, and political hostages. The silence of the academic world on the blockade is astonishing. Recently, I co-edited, as Marc said, a roundtable discussion in the International Journal of Middle East Studies with my colleague and friend, Dr. Sosi Kasparian, entitled Fault Lines and Fractures in the 2020 Artsakh-Nagorno-Karabakh War, Silence, Absence, Erasure in Middle East Studies, that addressed the silence of scholars of Middle East studies to the Azeri invasion of Artsakh in 2020. This was the result of multiple efforts by the Society of Armenian Studies when I was a president to ask NAASR, to ask MESA, Middle East Studies Association, to send out a statement regarding the war, where, however, they failed to do so. My article in this roundtable, Ambivalence to Things Armenian in Middle Eastern Studies and the War on Artsakh in 2020, dealt with the history of marginalization of things Armenian in Middle Eastern Studies due to several factors. First, ambivalence to things Armenian. Second, ignorance. Third, Turkish propaganda in the course of history of MESA. And finally, reluctance to understand what, who, and where Armenians are or where they live. The process of putting together this roundtable, which featured 13 articles, mostly dealing with Armenians, but there were some dealing with the Copts and Assyrians, took a year and a half. Middle Eastern Studies itself represents only a small fraction of the overall academic field, as you know. I will outline now what I think are some of the reasons of the ambivalence in the academic world and what could be done in order to enlighten the academic community about the dire situation in Artsakh. Of course, these are just randomly selected and put. First of all, geographical proximity to Europe. Second, Artsakh conflict has become similar to other, and I quote, in quotes, non-relevant conflicts of the East, such as Yemen, Palestine, and Afghanistan. In the hierarchy of conflicts that attracts Western and global attention, Artsakh occupies one of the lowest positions. Third, strong Azeri propaganda to divert attention from the conflict through using oil as a chip. Fourth, racism. Armenians are not white and do not have blue eyes and yellow hair. Fifth, the Ukrainian war, which has attracted more attention than any other conflict in the recent period. Sixth, it is happening in the Russian neighborhood, hence who cares? Seventh, the major countries in Europe and US have already, quote unquote, paid their dues to Armenians by recognizing the Armenian genocide. This is indeed ironic, as some Armenians of Artsakh today are facing impending genocidal campaign, namely through starvation and blockade. Of course, there are other factors. Now, the question is, what could be done? Academic world works very slowly. Most historians like myself write about events after the fact, meaning ex post facto. Writing an academic article or a book about the crisis takes months, if not a year, if not years. Hence, the efforts are futile to address the crisis. However, there are many things that scholars can do. First, write statements protesting the blockade. Second, mobilize prominent figures to sign, non-Armenian figures to sign such statements as was done during the 2020 war. Use your contact in academic world to raise awareness about humanitarian crisis. Fourth, write to human rights groups urging them to act. Fifth, put together symposia as such. Six, use social media extensively. Seven, do not preach to the crowd. Do not preach to the Armenian crowd. We know what's happening. 8, write to major newspapers to raise awareness. Imagine it took 1 month for the New York Times to write a piece on the blockade. 9th, alert academic world and the media that there is an impending genocide in the region. And finally, send opinion pieces to major and minor newspapers. Yesterday, prominent scholar of the Armenian genocide, Suren Manukyan from the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute, made an important point during an interview. He said, and I quote, "If we escalate the Artsakh question to the level of genocide recognition, then we will get results," end quote. But again, how many decades has the genocide recognition has taken to be fruitful? I am pessimist regarding the efforts of the Armenian government to raise the issue of Artsakh on the international level. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you, Marc.
Great. Thank you, Bedross. Wow, a lot to be pulled out of that short presentation. Thank you very much. David Phillips.
Marc, thank you very much for organizing today's panel. Commendations to you and NAASR, and also Christina and Maranci for taking the lead in making this happen. I also want to say how pleased I am to join a panel with other esteemed panelists. So thank you very much for having me. I want to focus my remarks on what I'm calling the second Armenian genocide. The recent events in Artsakh represent not only clear violations of international humanitarian law and human rights abuses, but they are furthermore an attempt to purge Artsakh of its Armenian population, to enslave Armenians in Artsakh to Azerbaijan's agenda and will. And unless the international community responds to that and is clear in drawing a line that highlights the problems and the crisis, the situation will get worse, not improve. So my remarks today focus a bit on the historical context. I'll talk about the current crisis and offer some policy recommendations. The second Armenian genocide, I think, is an appropriate term. Blockading Lachin is a flagrant violation of IHL. It disrupts access to the essential goods and services that the people of Artsakh need. These include food, fuel, and medication for 120,000 Armenians in Artsakh. Placing them under a blockade affects the most vulnerable populations, the elderly, and others who are suffering as a result of policies imposed by Azerbaijan in collaboration with Turkey. The humanitarian crisis is further aggravated by Azerbaijan's disruption of the natural gas supply to Artsakh, which has left houses, hospitals, and schools without heating. Internet and electricity supplies have also been interrupted. The latest round of conflict started on April 2nd, 2020, when Azerbaijan attacked on multiple fronts. Azerbaijan was flush with money from oil and gas exports. It spent $4 billion buying Smerch rocket systems, Grad missiles, Russian-made T-90 tanks, TUS-1A flamethrowers, helicopter gunships, and kamikaze drones. Azerbaijan was essentially armed to the teeth. Of course, Ilham Aliyev did not act alone. Turkey acted in solidarity with its Turkic brethren by deploying armed drones and F-16s provided to it by the United States. According to eyewitness accounts, Turkish troops and equipment were involved on the front line near the Iranian border. Erdogan made his intentions clear when he vowed, Nagorno-Karabakh will be returned to Azerbaijan. We will support Azerbaijan until the end. Turkey wants to expand its diplomatic role and become a co-chair of the Minsk Group. In my view, this is totally unreasonable and impossible. Turkey is a protagonist in the conflict and ill-suited for that role. Turkey has maintained a blockade of Armenia since 1992. Erdogan scuttled the 2009 protocols to open the border and have diplomatic relations with Armenia, which his diplomats, in fact, had negotiated. After 44 days of bloodletting, Russia helped mediate a trilateral ceasefire on the 9th of November, 2020. The agreement requires Azerbaijan to guarantee freedom of movement for persons, vehicles, and cargo along the corridor in both directions. Lachin, as we know, is the only road connecting Artsakh with Armenia and the outside world. Many of you may be familiar with Columbia University's Artsakh Atrocities Project, which provides a voluminous documentation of human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law. I would refer you to it. It's a state-of-the-art compilation of what's happened since 2020, and it's updated regularly. In violation of the ceasefire obligations, Azerbaijan blocked the Lachin corridor on December 12, 2022. Baku said so-called environmentalists from Azerbaijan were responsible. Let me just say clearly and plainly that this claim is a farce. There is no independent civil society in Azerbaijan. Facial recognition software matched the photos of protesters with members of Azerbaijan's security services. The blockade has furthermore set back a peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan and undermined international confidence. Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, has called on Armenia and Azerbaijan to resolve their differences through bilateral negotiations. However, we all know from experience the importance of international mediation, and especially the importance of U.S. engagement. So let's think practically about what we can do. As the Minsk Group explores intensified mediation, representatives of the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh should be included in any talks about the future of Artsakh. The Biden administration should rescind its waiver of Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act until Azerbaijan lifts the blockade. International monitors should be deployed to Artsakh as witnesses to Azerbaijan's aggression, and their report should be disseminated to the European Commission, the European Parliament, and policymakers and opinion leaders in North America. As long as the current conditions persist, economic and diplomatic sanctions should be imposed on Azerbaijan by the United States and like-minded countries to punish its aggression. U.S. diplomats should return to Stepanakert, regardless of Baku's objection. In addition, the U.S. should deploy forces to Armenia to coordinate humanitarian relief for Artsakh. Right now, Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh is one of the most dangerous places in the world today. The U.S. has a national security interest in preventing an all-out war with serious regional implications. Tony Blinken and Samantha Power are saying all the right things. However, the Biden administration will be judged by what it does, not what U.S. officials say. It's very clear that Azerbaijan is acting as the aggressor. The Turkey and Baku have been conspiring to undertake this second Armenian genocide. As an energy exporter, Azerbaijan has cleverly positioned its role providing natural gas to enhance its what it can do in the Ukraine conflict. Turkey has also cleverly positioned itself as a mediator, half-heartedly committing to grain exports from Ukraine, refusing to impose international sanctions, and playing both ends of the discussion. So we need to be steely-eyed and recognize that Turkey is a co-conspirator with Azerbaijan. We need to recognize that the U.S. government is saying things that we appreciate, but it has not acted effectively. So I look forward to the discussion today as we explore additional steps that can be taken to draw attention to the crisis and to act in remedy to the atrocities that are being committed against the people of Artsakh.
David, thank you very much. We now go to Lara Setrakian. Lara.
First and foremost, I'm so happy to be on a platform with Marc, Christina, and these wonderful guests. I also have to give a shout out to Shushan Tiker, who's been my original link to NAASR, my beloved friend, mentor. I am here as a journalist who happens to be Armenian, who happens to have covered a few conflicts and revolutions. And I can tell you that it is always the case that certain conflicts become the famous ones. Syria went from being a completely ignored conflict to a celebrity conflict, back to an ignored conflict. Yemen has never really gotten the pickup. I derailed my career in television to focus on conflicts because of how I saw Iraq and Afghanistan functionally get ignored after essentially very, very soon after the invasion of those two, or the arrival of Western troops into those two countries, however one might describe it. So I know that this happens, and there are many reasons it happens. Why is it that some issues get more coverage than others? Why is it that some conflicts get more coverage than others? The last time I saw David Phillips was when he was standing up for human rights in Syria, and I was covering human rights in Syria at a time when very few people were paying adequate attention. And then a bunch of journalists did get involved. They all won their awards, and then they went home, and very few people are still speaking about what's going on there. So it's an unfortunate fact of the way that the news cycle works. Ironically, the more an issue is covered, the more people understand and sympathize and feel they understand the characters or one person they can relate to, whether it's the president of Ukraine or anyone else, the easier it is for journalists to then get that story covered because there's more interest, and editors assume that there is more interest. And there are many reasons to imagine why certain publications cover things a certain way. But at the end of the day, it's much simpler than everyone thinks. And so the other reason I was so passionate about joining this call is for frankly, the fact that basic media literacy has a very big role to play in this. I understand how emotional and how difficult and frustrating it is when a conflict that someone cares about isn't covered in the press. I don't actually agree fully with the title of this event. I don't think there has been complete and total indifference. There are journalists covering it. There are some talking about it. And the place to start is always with those individuals, thanking them for their coverage, thanking them for the attention they pay, talking to them more, commending them, sending them thank you notes. If you're in a position to support their work, look at what Freedom House and others have done, Human Rights Watch and others, they all have their moments, and Amnesty had a very big moment, whether it's sooner, whether it's later. The first step is to thank those who are paying attention and to support them. David's been tirelessly, his institute has covered these issues for so very long and relentlessly so. So I think that's important. Second, it's extremely important, and this is hard, I understand. It's important to be frustrated and to be angry if that's how you feel. But after that passes, to actually follow a very simple formula, and the more people follow this formula, the more this will be fixed, the more actual coverage and attention an issue will get. And the formula is the following: think rationally, write calmly, and tell your own story. I was quite frustrated at certain publications not covering the conflicts and the issues here in the past 2 years. This time around, I just pitched them on covering it myself and writing my own story, noting that I am of Armenian origin, being extra careful to not just fact check everything that I submitted, but to provide non-Armenian sources and annotation for everything in the article, every piece, every claim, every quote. To speak to Azeri analysts, there are some very wonderful, rational Azeri analysts who've shared their perspectives with me. They're mostly based abroad. And the only one I spoke to in Baku was clearly constrained in what he was able to say, which is a feature of people you speak to, was Zaur Shuriev. And I shouldn't say that he was constrained, but it felt a little more difficult to have an open conversation. It often does. Maybe it was my imagination, but it is often the case in countries that have controlled information systems. But to really strengthen what it is you have to say, and then write to newspapers rationally, calmly, with solid annotation, thank publications that cover the crisis. If there was something you didn't like in their coverage and that was factually incorrect, write a calm and rational letter to the editor pointing out the error and the reasons and the annotation for that error. To understand that however emotional one may feel, screaming at the internet does not work. Screaming at editors and publications does not work. They will turn off in a second. I just heard today about some Armenians meeting with a very high-level diplomat in the EU and just basically ranting at the person, and the person walked out of the meeting. That's not an effective way to tell your story or to communicate your frustration, frankly. And also, debating irrational actors on Twitter and Facebook does not work. You're not going to convince anybody. You're far better off asking your local library to organize something about human rights and telling Armenia's story, and to ask NAASR for a panelist or any one of these wonderful people or any professors out there. I don't know that we fully understand how powerful it is when one tells one's own story, rather than getting upset that others are not telling your story. And whether that's at your local library or in your county newspaper, and just, again, doing so as rationally as possible, and understand that because there is a competition for attention, and it is unfortunate, trust me, I've staked my life on this fact, it's very unfortunate that the issues that matter most in the world seem to get the least coverage. And, celebrity divorces and scandals wipe clean the in the middle of when I was covering the Iran uprisings in 2009, it was obviously a huge global story, a huge human rights story. And Michael Jackson died in the middle of it. And then nobody was talking about people dying in the streets of Tehran. And I think there was some dark humor on people saying, did the Ayatollah kill Michael Jackson? Like, this is just too convenient. So it is a fact. This is how it works. And if you want more coverage, not only do you have to tell your own story, but you do have to understand how it relates to the people you're trying to reach. They haven't met many Armenians. They haven't met many Armenians in Artsakh. They don't know this story. And so what I often say as a journalist covering this region, and always, I'm not writing about this region as an Armenian. I'm writing about this region as a journalist. But my belief and what I stand by is that if you care about these values anywhere, you care about them everywhere. If you're sitting in New York talking about human rights and justice and the sacredness of human life, then you care about it everywhere. And so, and frankly, look, it is a little bit ironic, and it can be pointed out that we seem to care a lot these days about autocracies beating up democracies next door, or this idea that we're back to the law of the jungle and some stronger country can just beat a smaller country into submission. We've taken a position as Americans that that's not okay. And so pointing out that that is happening elsewhere is an important way. You'd call it a rider, but it's not. It's kind of a rider. In the sense it rides along, right? The decision that Americans have made that in Ukraine has shown us that we care about small countries and democracies trying to thrive and exist without being torn apart or eaten for lunch by their neighbors. So pointing that out is a relevant way to explain why this matters. There are many more reasons as well. And, just a final thought, I think compassion goes a long way. People are busy. People have a lot they're worried about in their personal lives. Editors have a lot they have to squeeze in. Make the case, try to empathize with how difficult it is to understand these issues. A lot of the coverage I see, even when Armenians are giving interviews or writing articles, is hard to understand. It's hard to understand. One must think about how to make it easier to understand. And then to get people understanding a little bit and a little bit more and a little bit more. And actually, one other thing I should say, I did move to Yerevan at the beginning of the pandemic, in January 2020. I've lived here since. I now run a think tank here. We call it a policy accelerator. And I will say that from the perspective of that think tank, the Applied Policy Research Institute of Armenia, APRI Armenia, when you start doing things like that and you start rationally mapping out, well, who is interested? Let's talk to them. Who might be interested? Let's propose it to them. You might get 3 no's, but you'll get 1 yes. There is so much more. There are so many more gains to be made. There's so much progress to make that I can't possibly be angry or disappointed yet, until we've really done our best to reach everyone who could be interested in hearing about this and then see what happens. And so I really recommend everyone has that power in their own community, again, from your local library to your county newspaper to anything beyond. And thank you notes. Please don't beat up the BBC because you disagree with 2 words in the article or 2 words in the piece. If you have an issue with it, write to them rationally and tell them what you disagreed with and why. But slamming them, guess what? If they get trolled by 1 million Armenians, they're not going to want to cover this again. So, this all has a consequence.
Lara, thank you. David, I see your hand is up.
It is. Let me just say a word about branding. We use the term the Second Armenian Genocide to characterize recent events. I think that's a compelling term. It requires the listener to pay attention. So I would think about how we brand the recent events in order to get an audience. I also think that there's an innate reluctance to criticize U.S. officials. We know that we want to have good relations with U.S. officials. Tony Blinken may be a good friend of mine or of other panelists, but unless you're speaking critically, you tend to be ignored. So I wouldn't be bashful about calling out U.S. officials, about correcting statements. The idea that Armenia and Azerbaijan should work out their differences bilaterally, sure, that makes sense in a poli-sci course. But in the real world, unless the U.S. and the Minsk group is involved, we're not going to see any progress. So I wouldn't let stand calls for bilateral discussions. U.S. mediation is critical.
And now we'll go to Henry Theriault.
Thank you so much, Marc. And to follow up with David, you could certainly make the argument this is actually, we're on the brink of the 3rd Armenian genocide. If we look at 1894-96 through the Genocide Convention lens. But your point is extremely well taken and much appreciated. Regarding the Rwandan and Bosnian genocides, the framework of the US State Department and global media was simple. 2 or 3 ethnic groups had been in a very long, senseless, irrational ethnic conflict that had no specific cause and was utterly intractable. What is more, whenever it seemed one or another of the groups was being victimized, that was just a point in an oscillation between perpetration and victimization. Everybody is bad, and no one deserves help protecting their lives and basic human rights. That was the attitude that allowed the Rwandan genocide to happen without any external intervention, when intervention would have been very easy. and complicated and allowed the Bosnian genocide to go on for a number of years. The reality was quite different. Despite some instances of human rights violations from the victim ethnic group side, there was no question in the actual evidence that the violence was not balanced, and what is more, one side had a clear intent to commit genocide and was doing just that. This model we can term the cycles of violence or mutual conflict model, and it is typically misapplied to one-sided violence. It is in fact the default position of journalists, especially in an age of erosion of the investigative journalistic standards that did exist in past eras. Those holding this position, however, are not neutral. They're pretending to be neutral, they're not. They are presented with evidence that there is a case of one-sided violence, yet they misrepresent it as a mutual conflict. In doing so, they side decisively with the perpetrators of the violence. Okay, and I can think of Tom DeWall, who I think might have been mentioned already, as a great example of someone who claims to be neutral between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but his neutralism actually has very significantly supported Azerbaijan's ability to continue its actions in the last few years with impunity. In adopting this kind of false neutrality, these folks actually support those who have the power to stop the violence, that is the direct perpetrators, by giving them this sense of impunity. But they also contribute to preventing on a very practical level the legal and political interventions that could push the perpetrators to stop their actions. There's always a calculation, and there's always a point at which a perpetrator group will stop what it's doing if the price is too high. For Azerbaijan right now, and for a number of years, there has been absolutely no international price paid at all. And it's no wonder that that sense of impunity and even entitlement allows the violence free rein. Since 1988, obviously, this model has been applied by journalists and policymakers to the attempt by the indigenous Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh to prevent their being ethnically cleansed from their homeland by Azerbaijan. This appears to be part of the legacy of both Turkish denial of the Armenian genocide and the genocide itself, the 1915 genocide and even going before to 1894-96. What do I mean? The first point is simple. Turkish deniers and their mercenary academic supporters have promoted a cycles of violence, mutual conflict argument as one of the key denialist foundations. And that has been simply applied to the latest attempt to eliminate Armenians from a part of their homeland. Nothing new. We can call it a kind of plagiarism. Second, all genocide victim groups face a multiple challenge. Because of the demographic, resource, and other practical impacts of genocide, they are even, and I would say, radically more vulnerable after genocide, even centuries after, than they were before. And remember, they were really vulnerable because a perpetrated group could actually commit genocide against them. You have to be vulnerable to be victimized by genocide. They simply don't matter politically because they are weak and small. What is more, and this is the second issue, genocide actually stigmatizes victims in the same way that rape can its victims. It causes others to see them as appropriate victims of violence. If Armenians are again facing mass violence and human rights violations, well, that's the norm for Armenians. So what is to be done? It normalizes victimizations for a group. One can only imagine how much of a contrast there would be if a group of people who had not been historically victimized were in the same situation as Armenians in Artsakh. This would be viewed as unacceptable victimization, unimaginable victimization, and intervention would be swift and decisive. As Professor Matossian mentioned, and I pointed out in a controversy I got into around these issues in 2020 with a number of genocide scholars, this is compounded when journalists, academics, and policymakers have actually voiced concern about past victimization of a group. I would go so far as to say that the Biden administration's recognition of the Armenian genocide was done as part of a tacit agreement with Turkey, that this would be the price of allowing Turkey and Azerbaijan to do anything they wished to Armenians in the present era. The key root of this cycles of violence, mutual conflict approach and its misapplication to situations like the Artsakh situation is the failure of people to look at the context of contemporary violence that they're seeing. Even the situation before the 2020 war should have been clear to the world community. Armenians were at risk. The one-sided 2020 war and mass human rights violations after it were simply the activation of the violence by Azerbaijan and Turkey that had been in stasis prior to that war. The ideology was in place, the attitudes were in place. Instead of a cycles of violence mutual conflict model, cases such as Rwanda, Bosnia, Armenia and Artsakh, Tigray, and even Ukraine, which has not been misportrayed in these ways in the present, but in the past has been, need to be seen through a framework which we might call a perpetual genocide framework. Rather than a back and forth historical process of mutual victimization, in cases such as Artsakh, the dynamic and the Armenian genocide before, the dynamic is one-sided and long-term. As many scholars have pointed out, genocide is a process, not an event, and that process can unfold over decades and even centuries. For instance, in Australia, Canada, and the US, a long period of direct exterminatory violence in the 19th century morphed into a cultural and often physical genocidal process in the 20th century through residential and boarding schools and child removals, all part of that same overarching genocidal process, which coincidentally in the 21st century has again morphed into an environmental destruction-driven form of genocide. The upshot is rather simple. Looking at the Artsakh situation simply from even 1988 to 2023, let alone 2020 to 2023, causes an inadequate and skewed understanding of the actual dynamics at play and is a significant obstacle to a genuinely human rights respecting solution. It must be seen as part of more than a century of genocide from 1894 to the present, not only targeting the same group and involving the same perpetrators, but based on the same ideology, which is still in place from the 1890s and 19-teens, because Turkey has never gone through the rehabilitative process necessary to extirpate the deeply entrenched genocidal attitudes embedded in the educational, political, corporate, and military institutions and cultures of its state and civil society, and indeed has exported this ideology to Azerbaijan, who we might say has become more Catholic than the Pope. Our hope is that we can change the framework, and I believe that is the only way we're going to change the way this situation is viewed. I will be very frank, I don't think that can happen in time, given how quickly the situation is accelerating now, but we have to try. Thank you for your kind attention.
Henry, thank you so much. I believe Lara and then David would like to comment before we continue with the discussion. Lara.
Sure. I just want to say one thing, and I'm certainly fascinated by all of your interventions, but Henry, I just wanted to say, I also think that those who conduct genocide are often, or blockades or other violations of humanitarian law on the flip side, are also generally very powerful and resource rich. And so it takes a lot of capital, political and social and financial capital at risk. As Michael Rubin said to me in an article I wrote for Foreign Policy, the US or others have to be willing to take risks in their relationship with Turkey and Azerbaijan or in other contexts, right? And I don't actually think, I don't fully agree with the thought that because I don't fully agree that if it were a fresh victim, so to speak, that there would be an automatic intervention and interest. I do think we see many cases in the world where there are relatively new crises or situations where a stronger power is trying to strangle either a minority population of its own or a smaller international cross-border party. And we don't see that intervention either. I could name so very many of them. But I do think, all your thoughts were fascinating there. But I think actually, even though it's sad and depressing that humanity has fallen so low, I think it's also important to understand that in many ways, we're not an exception. The lack of press coverage or the lack of intervention is not an exception. It's frankly more common than not. when you look at an international legal concept like the responsibility to protect, it hasn't been invoked frequently. And as my colleague Sheila Pylon often says, those concepts, and I'm sure David, you'd agree, those concepts and those instruments of international humanitarian law, they were created to be used. They weren't created just to be talked about or studied, but often they're not. And so I do think every Armenian and anyone from any background who wants their story told has to think about the ways big and small to do that, and the ways that are effective to do that. And those who want to see diplomatic breakthroughs have to do the work in studying how to create those breakthroughs based on what's possible, what's feasible. And, you know, you just have to do the work to figure out if there's a tiny glimmer of hope to save lives in a situation, what are the different ways that can happen? And actually the Hail Mary passes, or exhausting yourself, or getting angry on the internet, or, you know, martyring yourself in any other way isn't actually the way these things have succeed. It's not the way you get to breakthroughs. You get to breakthroughs by just, you know, figuring out what you can do, trying to see the bigger picture, and understand that in this conflict, Armenia is the weaker party in many respects. But at the very least you can do is use what is available. And now those things are not all being used right now.
Thank you, Lord. David, I believe, is next.
So I'd like to speak about the importance of truth and facts and moral authority. I appreciate your concern about the Biden administration's recognition of the Armenian genocide and your speculation that that was a green light that allowed Turkey and Azerbaijan to go forward. I don't think that our long-term and immediate goals are served by making accusations that aren't factually based. I wasn't in the room, so I don't know if anything like that was discussed. I suspect that it hasn't been discussed, and we should be careful about not making accusations that can further undermine our moral authority. And on the subject of moral authority, I'd like to just raise the importance of getting Nobel laureates involved in this discussion. When I headed the Nobel Foundation for Elie Wiesel, we organized an appeal that was signed by 58 Nobel laureates calling on genocide recognition and mutual recognition between Turkey and Armenia in order for the border to be open. Unfortunately, Elie Wiesel is no longer with us, but there are still laureates on that list that we can reach out to. Nobel laureates have a remarkable amount of moral authority. By associating with them, it enhances our authority. We have to be careful how we use that authority so that we don't discredit the cause and undermine the greater good.
Thank you, David. Henry, you're next.
Thank you. Just a couple quick things. First, Lara, I really appreciate your point. Absolutely, victims generally don't get support, and you're right, even new victims. And I was thinking of something like the Charlie Hebdo killings in France, which elicited this incredible world sympathy immediately, for a group that we're not used to seeing targeted. Whereas if that happened to Armenians or, somebody in Tigray or, pick your group that is often killed, it wouldn't have mattered as much. But your point is well taken, that quite often there's just indifference, and that's part of another whole set of dynamics. And David, I also appreciate your caution on my claims. I do want to be clear, I'm not saying that there was an actual agreement. I think I had said tacit sort of understanding that everyone had in mind. And I would pick up your, I think, excellent point that if I can say, the sort of squeaky wheel gets what it's trying to get. And in a case like this, I think a lot of Armenians in the Armenian community, when Biden recognized the Armenian genocide, thought that was just the greatest thing ever and gave the administration a pass on its really bad policies towards Armenians in practical terms. And I would say that there's a trade-off there that happened, that the Biden administration, and again, Bedross made that excellent point, that you kind of buy yourself off of this issue. If you recognize 1915, you're kind of immune from criticism. And again, I've run into this with genocide scholars. It's a challenge, but your point is well taken. I don't mean to suggest there was some controversy. I'm not I'm sorry, some conspiracy, anything like that. But I do think there was a dynamic in place where a calculation was made politically about what the Biden administration could do to continue favor with Armenians and allow itself not to deal with the situation in Artsakh.
Thank you. Bedross?
Quick few comments. I agree with Henry that there are certain societies around the globe where conflict is normalized by the West. A kind of, okay, we know this, it's going to happen, it's going to repeat itself, so who cares about it? Second, regarding media and the Artsakh conflict, I think we're dealing with major power structures here, Azerbaijan, Turkey, which has the ability, and Russia, of course, which has the ability to really divert attention of the international media. But also, I think the task of the urgent need now is not to deal with the conflict itself. Of course, the conflict is important, but deal with the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding now. Forget about the politics, etc. There's a humanitarian crisis. People are going to starve. 30,000 children are going to starve in Artsakh, and there's this is the most important thing now, which triumphs the rest of the thing, So opening the can, saying 1994, this and that, that's important, but there is an urgent case of humanitarian crisis that needs to be addressed in this day, tomorrow, or in the coming weeks.
Thank you. And Lara, and to the audience, we will be getting to your questions as well. Thank you.
I just want to say that I've come to the conclusion that the only thing worse than a terrible policy is a terrible policy that goes without notice. Is for that policy to exist without being called out and written about. And so our team, we've published in CNN, Foreign Policy, New York Times, Hindustan Times, Jerusalem Post, Haaretz, in Israel, where we see policies we don't like, we are writing about them. And I think it's important not just to be upset about them, but to communicate your upset about them. In my case, as a journalist, that involves writing. But taking that closer look, I think the smokescreen, if there is one, or just, being content that the Armenian genocide of 1915 was recognized, therefore this must be an administration with great policies toward Armenians. I don't think, digging a little deeper and understanding that there are policies that are very dislikable, not just to Armenians, but they're inconsistent with America's stance on the post-Soviet region and many other values. And frankly, I think unwise as well. I think it's important for every thinking person to look at the policies, especially of the countries you live in, around these issues, around the region. And if you dislike them, communicate about them to your own lawmakers, to your own communities, and if you can, if you're a journalist, certainly to write about them, but to do so in a way, again, that is thoughtful, calm, reasoned. Why is it a bad idea? It is a bad idea for everyone, including Azerbaijan, for that country to go so rogue as to eat its neighbor for lunch. No, that doesn't actually benefit anyone in the long run. And so whatever the thing is you disagree with, be specific, identify it, and write about it, because, again, the only thing worse than that policy existing is it existing uncontested and unspoken about.
David?
Let me just say a word about Section 907. It was wrong for the Biden administration to implement a waiver right after recognizing the Armenian genocide. One way to rectify that mistake is for the administration to say that 907 will go back into effect as long as the Lachin corridor is being blocked. That represents a significant coercive point of leverage, and a smart administration would be able to identify it and use it for that.
Thank you. It was important in putting this together today and formulating it that we did not want to engage in a protracted complaining or woe is us session. And I think we have so far succeeded in that regard. And I take Lara's point in particular on the title of the program, which was done with some intent to be a bit forward. about the issue, and also because the Artsakh blockade and global indifference with an asterisk, except for those people who have actually been doing something about it, doesn't ring quite so well. But
You're acting like an editor, Marc.
Yeah,
now you know why. Headlines are
and brevity is not usually my strength. But I do want to bring out the question that we do need to recognize the people and entities that have done a better job on this issue than most of what we're talking about. So I would like to just ask an open question. If there are any responses from scholarly bodies or human rights organizations that deserve to be mentioned here, and I realize we risk omitting people who do deserve to be mentioned. And are there places in the media where this issue for the past month and a half has been adequately covered? I'm told it's being covered better in, for example, France or in Italy than it is in the United States, which is putting the bar pretty low. But nevertheless, I asked that question, and we do want to recognize the good and not just complain about the bad. David.
Marc, one way to do that would be to compile the positive statements that you just referred to into a kind of morally principled database so that people are aware that we have friends and supporters out there. If there was such a compilation, we would post it very conspicuously on our Artsakh Atrocities Project page.
Very good. Henry, are you trying to say something? No, Bedross is. Sorry, Bedross.
Yes, Marc. We've done a lot of outreach to Armenian scholars and chairs and directors, etc., to sign statements. That's important. I mean, we need to do that. Even though we think it's useless, we need to raise our voice. But I think more work needs to be done to bring non-Armenian scholars, specifically those of Armenian or those of genocide studies, conflict studies, human rights, in order to bring them bring their attention to the crisis. And as David said, if we bring it under the title of an impending second genocide, I think it would attract more attention. So I think there needs to be a body of academicians / activists to really start dealing with this topic and bring awareness to the academic world itself. So, I mean, many scholars do not know the difference. They do not know the difference between Nagorno-Karabakh and Artsakh. When you talk about Artsakh, some of them don't know what Artsakh means even. They're only using Nagorno-Karabakh. So yeah.
And it was hard enough to explain about Nagorno-Karabakh, and now that, frankly, the terminology has, I think, for good reason, in the Armenian world, shifted towards regularizing Artsakh. Perhaps much of the world is even more confused than they were before. So that is a risk. Henry.
I just want to make a couple points. One is, I think we're in a crisis right now, and it is, and I really appreciate what Lara said about this is one of many crises in the world. Groups are facing similar kinds of issues. And it's a real global challenge. I don't think it's any worse now than it's been at any point in the last 500 years, but it is a problem. That said, even in the midst of a crisis, I think it's really important to think long-term and strategically. The process that Armenia is in right now and the situation with Azerbaijan and Turkey, while there are disastrous possibilities in the next month, 6 months, year, is also a very long-term process. And after the 2020 war, I immediately thought, okay, and I'm old enough to be a veteran, and Marc, you're sort of in, I hate to put you in this category as well, but 80s, 90s, we were youngsters fighting denial of the Armenian genocide. And the 30-year process that it really required to make some headway on that issue. And I think we're now facing, in terms of the way that the Artsakh situation is presented and the sort of way it's going to unfold, we're looking at decades of work ahead to try to sort of address the issues that are there. And I think it's we respond to the crises, but we also have to think carefully. And Lara really emphasized the issue of being rational in how you approach journalists. You're not just trying to get them to say something today. You're trying to educate people about an issue that's going to be unfolding for a long time. And I think that's really important. The other small point is oh, sorry, I actually forgot it now, so I'll let it go at that. I'll remember it in a second. I got carried away with the other one. So
I'd like to raise an issue that was and I think dovetails with one of the audience questions, but this was sent to me by a colleague who was not sure he was going to be able to attend the program today. And he wrote that regarding global indifference, the fact is that our reactions and comments do not reach the non-Armenian audiences, while Azeris have a number of international TV broadcasts pumping out anti-Armenian propaganda and claims. Is it not time to rectify this and establish an English language satellite broadcast program with news in different languages in order to present to the international audience, a different side to the story? And an audience member today writes that Turkey is spending millions on advertising to rebrand itself in Azerbaijan and is resource rich enough to influence news executives and foreign governments towards their perspectives. News is a business. Don't we need to give the indifferent more reasons to identify with and become sympathetic to Armenians suffering? So there's a lot there. I'd like to invite all of you to address that, but I'd like to start with Lara, since she is in the biz.
Yes, 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 and yes. However, good luck audience building if one were to start a new channel or something like that. I think actually I've dealt with many outlets in many countries and who have many motives behind them. And so the fact, Turkey now has TRT World that certainly takes its opinion on things. So many countries launch news outlets that have their foreign policy views reflected in the coverage, no doubt. But I don't think that is the way that this information environment will be improved. I think good old-fashioned journalists filling, it's a news desert. Armenia has traditionally been a news desert, but now there are more journalists covering it and facilitating. We've hosted some journalists who've asked for our advice and expertise from our scholars or relationships, making it easier for journalists to cover Armenia. And for Armenian journalists to rise, frankly, and providing the sort of training opportunities and other ways for this to happen. I do think it's regretful that we don't have more journalists, and including more Armenian journalists covering the region. But that's a function of many things. And I think at the end of the day, still, telling your own story matters, and committing to doing great journalism. EVN Report does terrific journalism. They're based here in Yerevan. It's a very big step forward. So I just, it's a very, sometimes I call it, what do I call it? The sort of acupuncture of the news cycle. You have to be smarter. There's no real blunt way to solve the information deficit. But I think there's a lot ongoing for this story right now. When I tell my non-Armenian friends that I'm running a think tank in Armenia, one of the things I say is we've launched a new think tank in the heart of the post-Soviet arena. That's a really compelling thing right now. What's happening, the fate of countries in the post-Soviet arena is of quite high interest right now. And so sometimes it's about understanding the way that the way that this can be easier or more interesting for people to tune into. And then they can find the information. You can send the great article that is out there, or the EVN Report site, etc.
Thank you, Laurel. Bedross?
Launching a channel, you need extensive access to resources, millions of dollars that Armenia does not have the capability, and the diaspora is reluctant to do that. But one thing I think lacks here in the United States is an Armenian think tank. All right, we have few of them in Yerevan, and in the United States, you don't have a single think tank that where you have experts whose job is dedicated to analyze, provide summaries or policy briefs to interested bodies, right? We don't have that here. We have few respected academic organizations, but nothing dedicated to issues dealing with policy making within the United States. So.
Thank you. Well, we have a lot of good questions, and I will ask one from the audience, and then I will ask my co-moderator to take the next one. And it is how much from the academic realm, how much of a factor is Turkey slash Azerbaijan buying university chairs an issue in the relative lack of academic attention this issue is receiving? David.
So I think in addition to buying academic chairs, we need to be aware of the millions of dollars that Turkey and Azerbaijan spend on K Street with think tanks, groups like the Atlantic Council, who take millions of dollars from Ankara, and then that affects their point of view. They become then propagandists for Turkey and Azerbaijan's points of view. So it's not just academia that is at the public draw. It is also think tanks who are supposed to be credible. You can't take money from an interested party and then purport to be objective.
I concur with David, Marc. I mean, there's Armenian studies has a great challenge today too within the academic arena. It's not only denial of the Armenian genocide, now it's an obfuscation of the history of Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh, and there are major initiatives are being taken on the side of Turkey, not necessarily giving the money from the Turkish government to its share, etc., but through non-profit organizations, but giving money to projects such as sponsoring the publication of a book that deals with the history of Nagorno-Karabakh, denial of genocide under the we've discussed this a long time ago about semi-professional, semi-scholastic books on the so-called, from their perspective, so-called Armenian genocide. So it's the challenge. There are multiple challenge: political challenge, policy challenge, and academic challenge. So if everyone does their work correctly, I think we'll be in a better situation.
And we have seen a seamless transition or continuity among some of these scholars, or let me call them by a different name, credentialed academics who engage in denial of the Armenian genocide, readily expanding their footprint into pro-Azerbaijani, anti-Armenian denialist propaganda as scholarship of a different kind. This is not the time to get into that in depth. It will be the time to get into it in depth in another program, I think. Christina.
As Bob Woodward has said, we should follow the money.
As always.
We should figure out where the money is coming from, where it's going, and we should publicize that as a way of leveling the field.
Okay, there's so many questions, so many great ideas in the chat, and it's really hard to pick one, but I would say one of the themes of the questions is, how can we approach certain sectors? And one of those sectors is religious leaders. So Alice Petrosyan is asking, why have our religious leaders not gotten engaged? And we need to, how can we galvanize the church, presumably, in this? And it does, that is an interesting sector of this. And thinking about, for example, the Christian, solidarity groups, news coverage coming out of that sector. In some ways, there has been a particular sympathy because we're dealing with Armenian churches. But I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about the best way to engage with the church, whether we're talking about the Armenian church or the more generally.
Christina, one thing I think is that, as far as I understand, this conflict is not it's not a religious conflict, regardless of the fact that Armenians are trying to represent it as Christian versus Muslim, but that's not working either in the Western media. That's tactic that Armenians are using to show that Christians are being attacked by Muslims. It's not religious conflict. Second, I think, as far as I know, World Church Council, which Archbishop Viken Aykazian was the head, I don't know if he's the head still of the World Church Council, has issued, I don't know if they issued a statement, but nothing has been done within the United States as in approaching the leadership of the different denominations, non-Armenian denominations, Presbyterian, Anglicans, etc. So I don't know, that's another thing that needs to be targeted.
Lara, David, Lara, whichever one you want to go.
So I wrote a piece for First Things, which is a very prominent Catholic and sort of pan-Christian publication. And it was important to me to do so, even though I've never written, actually, well, also Christianity Today, which is more evangelical, also wrote about this issue, and they've done great ongoing coverage of the Caucasus. I see it as very important. I was very proud to write that piece for First Things. I really, even though I don't agree with their positions or, every single position represented in that publication, it is an important one. And it's a question of empathy and compassion, not just solidarity. They wanted to know how people they can relate to, Christians in Karabakh, are dealing with the holiday season, are faring in this crisis. How is their faith holding up? What's holding them up? How are they getting through it? And I considered it a great privilege to share that story. I think it does, one of my other mentors other than Shushan Tiger is Roberta Irvin. And she has this, she told me once, and she's also my therapist, my informal therapist. I come to her in moments of despair. And she says, I do a good Roberta, I think, Armenians organize like Mercury. And so a lot of this outreach or solving a problem like like Mercury, right? Everyone sort of, so they come together and like they go back together in little droplets. So I do think there is not really a coordinated, concerted interreligious outreach, although the World Council of Churches does have a strong Armenian presence. But I do think it's important for people to go to, like Mercury, to their own religious communities and tell these stories, or platforms that they know of to tell these stories, because this comes up also in the question box. These are smaller audiences. Libraries might be smaller audiences, but you never know what's going to tip the scale. And again, it's far better to be heard from in those smaller circles than to have absolute silence in every circle. So in the end, how to get up to religious leaders, those things are advocacy. I'm not an advocacy person, but how do you eventually get more religious leaders speaking out like Nobel Prize winners? That is more of a advocacy and strategy and outreach. That's not my job. I don't know that world at all. But I do think that Christian and interfaith communities are very, very sensitive to humanitarian disasters, and they care and they tune in as a result. And so if you are part of those communities, you should be ringing the bell.
And I'll just add myself that Lara and I were both involved with the Museum of the Bible show and the digital exhibition and the events associated with that, which was tremendous, I think, for educating the public. And I think, just being very informative and also it was a beautiful show. That leads to another question. I won't say any more, but on the chat, there was something about the destruction of Armenian heritage. And I think I don't know how that plays out in relation to the humanitarian crisis now, but what we've seen very clearly through satellite technologies is the destruction of heritage in Artsakh, incontrovertible. And so how that is going to play into what's happening right now on the ground in the Lachian corridor, I don't know, but it will be interesting to watch this. But that's something obviously that people get because it's visual, I will say. And I think that has a way of tapping into a public that isn't extremely complex.
Christina, may I speak out of turn and just underline what you underlined? Again, with the Museum of the Bible, that online exhibit on the churches of Nagorno-Karabakh, it's still online, and it is a precious example of our story being told by a major institution. Just Google Museum of the Bible and Armenians and churches, and it is rock solid. Christina was part of fact-checking it, annotated. I dare anyone to challenge a word of that text, and it tells the Armenian story. And now when you Google Dadivank, it is the second link after Wikipedia, which is the power of telling your story well with a great partner. And we should all be watching and thanking them for that work and sharing that website.
Yeah, absolutely. absolutely. Okay, I think Hank, David, whichever.
David was actually before me, so
Okay.
please.
Go.
Let me say a word and then I'm going to have to depart for another meeting. There was a remarkable international coalition, including faith-based organizations that organized around the imprisonment of Pastor Brunson. I would look at those organizations, target them, share information with them, see if we can create a kind of coalition of groups that we could reach out to. And in order to do that, it usually helps to have an organizing point. I would suggest that the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, which was founded by Georgette Bennett in the name of Marc Tannenbaum, who was my rabbi growing up, would be a terrific organizing vehicle for reaching out, establishing coalitions, building some consensus, and building on this question of religious freedom and the particular persecution of Christians that we see in Artsakh and that we see in Syria by Turkey and elsewhere. Can I just say my apology as I depart?
Yeah, but before
David, do you have 30 seconds to stay? Because I remembered my other comment that I wanted to make, which is about this long-term process. In terms of, we want a new television channel and so forth. That's like a big, we're just going to solve the problem overnight. But really, it's about grassroots changing of people's minds and talking to individuals and getting things out. And I wanted to actually cite your the listserv that you have, the series of emails that you send out from the program on peace building and human rights at Columbia, which I think is excellent, not just on Armenian issues, but a range of issues. And it's those kinds of things that actually over time not only become credible sources for people. I look for it, I'm looking for the latest thing that you say and whatever, but it can, over a long period of time, can really change the framework and the discourse on an issue in a way that's much richer, I think, than the last thing you saw was a television story that favored Azerbaijan or Armenia, and so it sticks in your head for 30 seconds, and then it doesn't really mean anything. This is a lot deeper work, and I think that's part of how we can approach this issue. So anyway, I didn't want to hold you up because I know you're busy, but I did want to make sure people knew about your work and how that can impact in a really positive way. And I did also, oh, go ahead. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Just Marc, before we turn to you, let me say that listserv and social media is such a more effective in terms of impact and cost than a very capital intensive television station or network. So there's a lot of room to develop that further.
David, before you sign off, since I know you're very shy, I would like to nonetheless ask you to mention you have a program coming up this next week and that people should look for more information about it. Could you please just briefly tell us what it is?
Yes, on the 25th, which is Wednesday at noon Eastern time, Columbia University will organize a panel entitled The Second Armenian Genocide. We have some experts. We've been in touch with some US senators. So we're expecting a very hard-hitting and honest discussion. I can share with you, Marc, the invitation to that, and with you, Christina, and you're all free to share it with whomever would be interested.
We will do so. Thank you very much, and thanks for making the time today.
Okay, thank you for having me. It's always good to be here.
Take care.
So
I hate to ask if I can also address the religion.
Oh yeah,
very
sure,
briefly.
please go ahead.
Just very quickly, I do appreciate, the work that Christina and Lara and others are doing is really important. And the whole heritage issue, which we know from the in Turkey and Nakhchivan and so forth, is just such a fundamental problem on so many levels. I do want to caution, however, I certainly understand the appeal of connecting on a basis of Christian solidarity, but I also want to be very careful. The Armenian genocide issue has been, I will say, appropriated in certain circles and misrepresented as a simple religious conflict and put into this sort of Christian Islamic class of cultures kind of framework. And I think that doesn't do anyone any favors. It really undercuts people's understanding of the complexity of Islam, not just in general around human rights, but also in relation to the Armenian genocide and the role of clerics, the positive role that many clerics played in that period, as well as a negative role that some played. But I think, using a religious human rights based approach, I think is really important, and talking to different communities, including Islamic communities, about, hey, this is not a good representation of Islam. This is not helpful. And we know you don't agree with it. Can you say something? And I think that can be helpful.
Very important.
Can I just jump in and say, and the other reason that it shouldn't really be kind of framed that way is because of the rising Caucasian Albanian circus, as some have called it. So, I mean, and this is, of course, we know that Azerbaijan is kind of parading as, this great multicultural state because of the UDI's, this sort of fictive Caucasian Albanian heritage that is being claimed as a direct connector to the UD community and everything that's kind of entailed. So yes, that's another reason that it can't be so simple. It can't be simply that dichotomy.
So there's a number of questions, and to the audience, we beg your indulgence. We could be here until Tuesday with all these questions, but I'm trying to at least bundle some together. Is there anything more in your view or in your views that could be done in Armenia or in Artsakh by the people or by the leadership to bring greater attention to the world outside and to the media? Would demonstrations and protests or other acts of nonviolent, civil disobedience or civil demonstrations help create attention? Could the Prime Minister of Artsakh do more to draw attention? Is this even a useful avenue of discussion to look to?
I'll take that being in Armenia and closely watching what's going on. I think a lot of things are being tried and a lot of efforts are being made. And so it's a bit spaghetti on a wall. You don't always know what's going to catch or what's going to work or what will create that momentum for international attention. So Artsakh Beglarian held sit-in in front of the UN, did that really move things. At the end of the day, it's always a function of these stories having a champion internally, someone who wants to pitch the story, someone who wants to write about the story, or someone freelance out here writing about the story. It's all very, very simple at the end of the day. A credible person writing credibly for a credible publication. And so you have to get those things aligned as much as possible. Can I very quickly speak to things that I'm seeing in the chat? One is to Anahit, yes, the mother of the student at Columbia. I think, no questions, David Phillips would want to be helpful to your child at Columbia who wants to do more event planning and such, and when we and others can be helpful, certainly. We organized a wonderful youth town hall here in late summer, and it was amazing to do that for young people, and there's certainly can be done again. And to the question of are Armenians simply destined to constantly be at the brink of annihilation because people want us annihilated? Look, what we're talking about today is part of a much bigger information war and information campaigns and intimidating information and statements and speeches and all that stuff. And so when you encounter, what that does, frankly, when certain leaders in the neighborhood talk as if it's a done deal, or talk as if talk down, talk to Armenians as a subject people of the empire many, many decades later, and all sorts of dog whistles and references to annihilation of Armenians, frankly, not very veiled either. Sometimes it's very overt in some way or another. It's painting a picture of a world that they want to see. And the question is, do you want to believe in it? Do you want to let that get in your head? Do you want that information campaign to work? Or at certain points you say to yourself, well, just because they want it doesn't mean they're going to get it. And what do you do to create a different reality and to stay engaged and to do constructive things, to not be intimidated, to tell your own story, to, I'm a journalist, I'm a humanitarian, I support people here working on education reform, all kinds of wonderful things that are happening in Armenia. And so I think the doom and gloom, the despair, the feeling as if there's indifference, we're poor us, it distorts the fact that Armenians have a lot of agency in this moment. You always have the agency of telling your own story, but also of building a great future, no matter what other people say they want the future to be, or they will, twist your arm or do this or that and try to, scare you into running away from the country or from the community or from your own identity, because it hurts so much to feel like you're constantly under threat. So it's a mental game that I've decided I want to win. And part of that is, not just being talked to in the information war, but in a way talking back and to say, it helps to be Armenian American, and I have more agency and more pluck than a lot of my colleagues here who have been swimming in this mess for a longer time than I have. But to say, okay, well, that's what you think and that's what you want to get away with. But, there are rules and norms, and we're going to push back. We're not just going to let it happen on our watch.
Yeah. Marc, answering your question, I think Artsakh is doing its best given the circumstances. They held a major demonstration, which was covered partially, I think. Armenia is doing its best, though, diplomatically, the International Criminal Court, etc. But I think it's high time that the diaspora also plays its role and brings its major initiative. I mean, remember, during the centennial, there were I think 100,000 people marching in Los Angeles during the centennial of the genocide. Now we don't see that happening. Maybe 20, 30, or 40 people. I think there needs to be mobilization of all resources. Answering this as a reaction to this major humanitarian crisis, which every day counts, every minute counts of it. Yeah.
Thank you. A number of people in the Q&A are asking about general approaches, strategic approaches, how to best write a letter to the editor, how to best pitch a story to NPR or a local media outlet. This is a real question. Obviously, I'm not sure we can answer that in short form today. Are there resources out there for people trying to do this? And is this is this something we should add to our list of things that we have failed to do to produce this kind of skill set? I don't mean that quite the way it sounds, but
don't be too hard on yourself.
Yeah.
Look, there's a lot of good samples on Google. There are. If you Google it, you will probably find very good guidance. It is not rocket science. Unfortunately, I'm sad to admit that my profession isn't actually that complicated or doesn't require that much skill. Actually, a very short, concise, well articulated and calm message into NPR asking them to cover a story is a real and effective way. And the more people do it, the more that request is heard. It is a public radio network. It is supposed to be responsive. But I also do think, Marc, that general media literacy, it's something that all countries and all societies are dealing with. And for NAASR or it with its partners to organize something on media literacy for our communities is probably a good idea. That's a skill building that I think would serve very well. And it's very timely.
Yeah, point taken. Henry.
I just want to follow up both to follow up what Lara was saying and also her great advice earlier on in how to approach things. And I have a comment and then maybe a question for her. The comment is going back to my idea that this is a long-term process. Part of engaging the media is building relationships over time. If you come out of the woodwork on a particular issue and they don't know who you are and what the issue is, it's hard for people to take that seriously. They've got competing stories. If you're a journalist, you've got all sorts of things. You're under pressure to, do this and that. If you've built relationships over time, like you're communicating, again, as Lara said, in a really humane way, respectful way, that kind of thing. You're writing in on particular issues regularly, that kind of thing. It can make a difference. The question I have for Lara is, in your experience, and and what you know about the sort of back room of decision making, editorial decision making, and so forth, does the volume of letters on an issue have an impact on whether that's covered, or is there something else going on that sort of determines what's covered, or maybe some combination of those?
It depends on the publication. If I had taken an alternate career path and been a lawyer like my parents wanted me to be, I might be writing to the Bergen Record right now in from Englewood, New Jersey, saying, hey, in Tenafly and in Fairlawn, there are churches rallying for these people far, far away. Will you write about it? You should write about it, blah, 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 blah. And so, community papers and that stuff, that's on the internet like anything else. So those hits matter, those stories matter, they scaffold up and they create awareness and momentum. I've seen, I won't say which publication, but one that all know very well, decide a priori what the story is before they go to the country, and just, they won't be pushed off that line, no matter what. And I've sometimes bested those publications in my own reporting because I followed the data and they were just ideological about it. So there's a lot of bad journalism and flawed reporting in that respect. And often it does come down to whether they have an in-house journalist who's aware and sensitive enough to the issue to pitch it to their editors and make the case. I've done some op-eds, I've had them accepted or had them rejected. And it's a function of many things. What else do they have running? How busy is it? Have they run something from the same region and they feel like, we did Eurasia, thanks, right? And so sometimes it's very simple and it's not really fully conspiratorial. I do think we've seen the UK press it sometimes really be very strange. I don't know what it is about the UK, but I do think a lot of UK publications, they just have an extra strange, I don't know. And it might be what they've been exposed to. And I admit this when I write about the Armenian situation, and that's why I think for me, the burden is on me to submit, and I do submit every article more than anyone has ever asked, with fact checks, annotations, and balanced sets of interviews as much as possible. Because when you spend all of your time in a purple environment, you see things in a purple way and you write things in a purple way. So when there's a publication that's writing in a way that Armenians deem to be unfair or biased, it could be because the person spent many, many years living in country X, or that they're aspiring to go to country X, so they're extra sympathetic to country X. So there are many things, but the process is always the same. If a publication runs something that you feel to be factually incorrect, you write a rational letter to the editor, fact by fact, and refuting it, right? I'm sorry, but when you don't like the New York Times coverage of the war, the correct logical leap is not that reporter is a paid lobbyist of Azerbaijan. I guarantee you, no one who is on staff at the New York Times is a paid lobbyist of Azerbaijan. If you feel there are flaws in their coverage, there are many things you can do about it. You can write in. I personally think some PhD student in media studies should do a deep content analysis of the New York Times coverage of the 2020 war, and then not only do that, but also send it to the ombudsman of the New York Times, because I think their coverage was very strange. And that includes the number of civilian voices covered and profiled on each side, the number of articles reported from each side of the line. It's very, very easy at the end of the day. If you think that there's bias, prove it, and then take it to that publication. If you think they should cover it and they're not, write to them, tell them they should be covering it. If there's a reporter covering that region or covering Ukraine, find a way to reach them and say, we pitch you on not missing this other crisis in the shadow of Ukraine. I'm talking a lot, but it is my profession. I get that there's, some insight into it, but really it's approach it as professionally as if you were a lawyer, or if you're a doctor, if you were an engineer. It's no different. So just because it's a very emotionally charged topic, or we feel very emotionally charged when one's own cause or story isn't covered, you wouldn't go yelling and screaming into a courtroom. You wouldn't go, or into a surgery, right? Because you feel strongly about a surgery. So, these are still always people and they make mistakes.
Lara, thank you. Well said.
Yeah, thanks for that.
We are going to wind this down shortly, but I want to squeeze in a couple of more things if possible. There are a number of questions about Russia, and in my own notes, I had written down that the crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh highlights Russia's waning influence was the headline of an article on time.com very recently. On the contrary, in an op-ed in the LA Times last week or recently, our colleague Salpi Ghazarian wrote that, quote, Armenians are blockaded and Russians are not keeping the peace, unquote. Not that they are incapable of keeping the peace or that they're distracted or whatever, but that they're choosing not to. So in the Western media, which is not generally taken for what you would call pro-Russian, do you think that Russia and its role has been actually getting left off the hook or left out of the picture to a certain extent?
I think that's the one thing that is getting coverage.
Say again?
I think that's the one thing that is getting coverage.
Please, go on.
I mean, I pitched the story that way as an opener, and that did get traction. And now, that's what we're seeing in the New York Times 40 days on. So the Russia's dropping the ball storyline being so in line with, I think, the current narrative in the world is actually, as a result, being the lead of the pieces, many of the pieces we are seeing about this situation. Sorry to jump before Bedross.
Okay, Bedross.
Yeah, Marc, I think nothing happens without the green light of Russia in that region. Russia has the power, unlike it's represented in the Western media, that it's leaning behind or it's losing its power. I think it has power in that region. It can stop everything. It could have stopped the war. It could fix this. It could fix this blockade issue in a matter of a day, but it's unwilling to do so for many different reasons, including its policies towards Armenian, Western orientation in Armenia, much more complex than it appears. But saying that Russia is weak and Russia is unable to handle the conflict, it's a fallacy, I think. I think Russia is able to do everything, but it's reluctant due to its policy towards the recent Armenian government and other major issues that are on the table.
Thanks. Thank you. Christina, do you have another one?
You could pick.
All right, I've got plenty at the ready, but much has been talked about in terms of appealing to international and audience sympathies and higher ground, all these things which are very important. The often referred to and often cited Thomas DeWall wrote recently, at the moment, the sympathies of the West are rather on the side of Armenia. First of all, do we think that this is accurate? And second of all, is sympathy going to determine how things are carried out here, or is the reliance on sympathy in fact going to exacerbate the situation?
Marc, I think sympathy is important, but as long as that sympathy is not put in action, nothing is going to change. During the Armenian genocide, everyone was sympathetic with the Armenians. New York Times ran 100 articles. All the international press were sympathizing with Armenians. But as long as that sympathy is not put into action, nothing is going to change.
Anyone want to add anything to that? I guess that sort of...
The U.S. has a lot of tools at its disposal and has agency. So I think sympathy without agency is one thing, but awareness of this and the importance of it, again, the baseline being zero coverage, the alternative being no coverage and no sympathy. You never want an issue to have no coverage and no sympathy, whether it's Armenia, Syria, Tigray, any place, right? So it is important that people understand the humanity at stake in this issue, but also to point out that the U.S. and many other actors are not powerless. And policy change comes about in many ways for many reasons. But I think it's good if you can understand and find and amplify the arguments for better policy on this, in the sense that, back to the US example, not just Section 907, but doing much more concrete work to balance and to deter aggression in this region and to deter the risk of all-out war. That's something the US and Canada and others, everyone can do, frankly. Every country can do, because Azerbaijan is more sensitive to the international community than other autocracies in the world. So I think that's an important part of it, is also highlighting that it's not that there's nothing to be done here. And that, again, I would stand by the claim that it's not good for anyone in this world, including Azerbaijan, for the current trends to continue, and for basically a very aggressive behavior, what is now recognized, especially after September, as extremely aggressive behavior, continue. It's great for rallying popular support, but even some Azeri analysts say it's not great internally for the government of Azerbaijan to have an all-out war, but to continue to use Armenia as a punching bag and as a rallying point and as a hate-mongering exercise is not in the long run good for Azerbaijan either. And it's certainly not good for anyone else, and goes against many legal and moral boundaries that the world is trying to set. And the world is not powerless to do anything about it. So I think those are important facts that need to be understood. And there was a question in this, is what is the power of retweeting? I think if you look at accounts like Lawrence Breuer's, if you look at Olesya Vardanyan at International Crisis Group, I'm not that active and I wouldn't promote myself that way, but others, people that are just rock solid resources on this, especially Lawrence Breuer's and Olesya Vardanyan, retweeting them is a great idea. They are authoritative. At the end of the day, there are people on this who are very authoritative. Not the least to say, if you are interested in advocacy, there are lots of advocacy voices out there as well. But if you're trying to understand and explain why what's happening is concerning, worthy of coverage, worthy of better policymaking and deconfliction, find those terrific voices and yes, amplify them and point people to them. And if you can get them on your local radio station, I'm sure they will take the interview, etc. So it's not just a sob fest.
Henry.
I was just going to add, and this is as much a question to the rest of the folks here as it is a comment on what I think it may be true. And that is, it doesn't hurt to have a kind of consistent messaging around a lot of these issues. And I think Section 907 actually is a very progressive piece of litigation that relates to the one instance of genuinely successful genocide prevention, I would say in our lifetime, which is the stopping in 1998-99 of the second genocide in East Timor that was starting and was stopped. And it was stopped, I think, in a really important way that 907 speaks to, if we could just get it enforced and maybe expanded. That genocide was stopped because the US, UK, and Australia changed policy from military support, including providing weapons to the Indonesian government, to withdrawing that support. If you take the guns, I hate to say it this way, you take the guns or machetes or whatever else away, that has an impact. And Azerbaijan has a clear military advantage that we're well aware of. If part of the campaign can be focused on, let's stop adding to this, incredible weaponry that they have relative to a very disadvantaged neighbor, I think that can resonate in certain circles in the US. It's very complicated because we're also, you get into the arms industry and that kind of thing. But I think there are messages that can be helpful if we can be somewhat consistent in presenting them and offer real solutions that can impact this issue.
Henry, this leads to a point. Christina, do you have anything you want to say? Okay, it leads to a point that I think maybe we can end on, if possible. Everybody here is either a journalist or has experience dealing with journalists or dealing with other entities. So this is the elevator pitch question, I guess. How do you pitch this story or this issue either to a media outlet or to an academic organization or a human rights group that convinces them that they need to cover it or cover it better or cover it differently in a fairly succinct manner? This includes you, Christina. You're a part of this group that's being asked. Who would like to go first? Perhaps the journalist would like to go first.
It depends on the publication and it depends on the audience. And so if you know that it's a publication that cares about humanitarian issues or about Christians facing dire conditions because it's a shared community, not because it's a religious conflict, right? But because they're humans and they can relate to those humans, and also they are a values-based organization that, you know, tends to value impact on human lives and families. If it's a geopolitical publication on its own importance, if you need those facts, go to those authoritative people like Lawrence Broers and International Crisis Group to get some grounding in why this is so very important. Yeah, and then just be rational, reasonable, and do spell check before you hit send.
Know who you're talking to. That's what I took out of that.
Find what is relevant to them.
Bedross.
Michael Rubin, Michael Rubin has written amazing work, and many of us know him. Michael Rubin isn't just a think tank specialist who seems to take a liking to Armenians. He is a seasoned, reasoned, thoughtful, incredible scholar whose writings lay out the case very clearly at the AEI. Is that AEI? Yes. Well, anyway, if you Google Michael Rubin in Armenian and you look at his writing, he's laid out the case for the geopolitical necessity of this issue being resolved well and peacefully, and not at the expense of one country, at the extreme expense of one country. So if you need some grounding, read what Michael Rubin's written, and that will help you understand, why it is of concern to the U.S. and its interests.
My 2 sentences: an impending genocide is underway, threatening the lives of 120,000 civilians. Please pay attention.
Thank you. Christina?
Okay, my 2 sentences are: imagine a country that uses language about cleansing and purity to exterminate a people, another group. Now imagine that that's their postage stamp, right? Because, hey, that was a good pitch, right? Because that's what we're talking about. This is the level of racial hatred that we're talking about. So, I mean, I think when I speak to students and my colleagues, there's a lot of discussion about racial hatred. But when you see this level of institutional governmental hatred, that's incredibly powerful. So that's what I would use.
Thank you. Henry, last word.
Okay, yeah, I would couch it first by saying, if you treat journalists as if they're supposed to be advocates for your cause, you're already going to lose them, because that's not their role. But I think it's to say, look, this is one of many issues that's going on in the world. We understand there's a lot of attention in a lot of different places, but your coverage could actually raise awareness of an issue that's not getting covered and could actually make a humanitarian difference. And as a journalist, I think that may have an appeal. That's the sort of highest ethics of journalism, is not to be an advocate, but to give people information that can help them make good decisions about how they want to approach issues at home and around the world.
And Henry, just to support that on the industry side, Amnesty International issuing what it issued is vital. That link going in there, that is no longer just a community concerned about its own, and others before. I mean, they were a bit late on it, but because it was so very clear. And I think that I pitched one publication, or as I submitted my highly annotated article to them, I said, I parsed through all of the back and forth and the information, because the narrative from Azerbaijan keeps shifting. So to track it, account for it, and try to make sure you have fact checked for it and done is actually it's very time consuming. And what I told them is I've been tracking the claims and counterclaims, but luckily, since all of the international statements, which come from countries who have satellite data and other things, have so conveniently laid out the fact base, it's actually easier for me to hold on, And so I think it's not just that the statements are made, and people often poo-poo the impact of statements. Taking a position or a policy position the way many countries have. And if you don't like the US, look at Canada, look at Mexico, look at, Netherlands. They've all sort of taken a very clear line on this, and they have very good intelligence, very good information. And then you add on organizations like Amnesty International, and this fact base is pretty clear. So now it's simply an issue and a conflict that's not getting coverage, which is always a compelling thing. And there's always an immoral imperative for journalists to pay attention to those. And I speak again as a journalist, not as an advocacy person. I have advocated for underreported stories my entire career, and I have staked my professional life on conflicts that deserve more coverage. And this fits all of those criteria.
I would just add, and I'm not friends with a lot of journalists, but I do know a number, and they're in journalism because they want to do this work. They care deeply about getting stories out. And yes, I mean, in any profession, there are better and worse people and so forth. But what Lara was saying, I think that appeal to why they do what they do, I think is really important, and understanding where they're coming from. And you're right, if they're not covering a story, they could just be working 20 hours a day, just not able to have the resource, all those kinds of things. Don't assume anything, but just really try to present, as you were saying, Lara, I love that, that here's an undercovered story that the facts are easy to get, and you can do this and have an impact. I think it's a great point.
Marc, I have a comment, a larger comment. I'd like to thank all the attendees and participants for the 67 questions, and I'd like, Marc, you to copy paste those, because those are food for thought. I mean, despite the fact that we weren't able to answer all these questions, they're really fantastic questions in those, and these are food for thought, which will help us, develop new ways of thinking, new policies, and it's a collective way of thinking. Not necessarily I'm the expert, you're the expert, and the audience are just here to listen. So no, that's
they will all be archived and shared with the panelists. And I hope one way or another, everybody will have a chance to read through them. And we truly do appreciate the audience interest, both in terms of the large number of attendees and the large number of questions that those attendees have provided. Questions and food for thought, indeed. So I want to thank, first of all of you, the panelists, and David in absentia for again carving out time in your weekend to participate in this discussion, which I think is a valuable one. I want to thank the Society for Armenian Studies and the Mashtots Chair at Harvard. I want to again thank the Kalus Gulbenkian Foundation for their years of support of NAASR's contemporary issues programming, of which this is, I think, an important example. And I've said many times now, I guess, over the past couple of years, one of the few advantages of the pandemic and its aftermath has been that we are able to do these sorts of things quickly, and we don't have to do it with months of lead time. So, but that requires wonderful colleagues and friends who are willing to say yes on short notice. So I thank you so very much for that. And please pay attention to our programming and other programs by other groups, including that mentioned by David Phillips, and everybody do what you can to stay informed. And we will leave it there for now. And I thank you. Good day.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Marc. Take care, Marc.
Bye, Henry.
Oh, I hope everything, does that seem to go well? I thought it